why I chose like this subsector kind of within here. Basically, like I cover the telecom sector with Ovaid, and you know, to the beginning of the semester, we saw a lot of like turmoil in the sector. We saw a lot of price gouging going on by the wireless carriers. We've seen like a lot of price wars there. Their margins are getting killed left and right. And with the internet service providers being like, you know, Comcast and like also Verizon, with net neutrality, they're also getting hit hard with that. And well, not to say hit hard yet, but it's up in air, and it can be very volatile. So we thought it'd be better to kind of move away from that a little bit. So I chose something a little more stable in that sector, which is a tower leasing company. And so I'm going to describe a little bit of that later, but let me just first get into a brief overview of what they do. And so like I said, they own the cell towers. They own towers on buildings, just freestanding towers, things like that. And they basically have two lines of business. First one being site leasing, which is just what I described to you. Again, I'll go into more detail about how that like cost structure and revenue structure works a little later. And the second one being site development, which is a much smaller portion of their operations, which is more or less like consulting out to other companies who are trying to do something similar, or like Verizon wants to own their own tower. We'll do some consulting for them to get them up and running. So, just overview of the industry. Again, it's very condensed. Only three major players. Like I said, SBA Communications, as well as American Tower and Crown Castle International. Now, American Tower has operations like all over the world, like Africa, Europe, India, some in South America as well. Crown Castle is mostly just in the U.S. and in Australia. Actually, they actually control 92% of all Australian wireless traffic, which is pretty surprising. And SBA has most of their operations in the U.S. with some internationally, and those companies, those areas would be Canada, Brazil, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Panama. So Central America, some South America, haven't gone overseas at all. And oh yeah, and so like I said, long-term leases, a lot of those start at like between like 15 and 20 years at the max, at the higher end, and generally have like 5-year kind of like kickers every so often. And so I'll be honest, I stole this slide from one of American Tower's presentations, just because it laid it out so perfectly, like how the cost structure works. So basically, you can see here, everything that's marked AMT is owned and operated by American Tower, or the leasing company, and the tenants pretty much own everything else. As you can see, quite a bit of the costs are borne by the tenants, which is really good for us, because like the costs are so little, and what this actually equates to is that if you want to add an additional tenant to the tower, it's so incrementally small amount of cost you have to put into it, but you get just as much revenue out of it. So it's really a beautiful structure. It's pretty amazing. Yeah, and like I said, the only real ongoing expenses are, like, well, I'll actually go over those later, but just in general, each tower has a general capacity of 4 to 5 tenants, and currently of SBAC, they have on average 1.8 tenants per tower that they have, so certainly some room to grow there. Some of the revenue drivers that you can see that kind of ends up getting a lot more net income for a company like SBAC or its competitors. First and foremost, being just expanding coverage by carriers. Like this is Verizon going out there and wants to serve some underserved area in the middle of Kansas or something. Previously didn't have any cell service. It also can be done by expanding bandwidth. When like if you're ever in a crowded stadium and you realize your phone doesn't work, that's because their towers are being overloaded. They can fix that by putting a new antenna on there, things of that nature. And again, that equates to like those much higher profits with much less cost, as I was saying before. And lastly, introducing new technology. Like so, we all had standard cell coverage for a long, long time. Then 4G came out, and that got put everywhere, and now that's everywhere. And that requires, again, more placement on the towers. All this is equating to more space being used on the towers, which equates to more leasing revenue. And just that graph right there is revenue exposure that each carrier has to the companies. And as you can see, this will come up later, SBAC has the highest exposure to AT&T out of all the companies. So Sprint has been doing a lot of capital expenditures for their 4G plan to roll it out, because theirs is lacking behind. I don't know if anyone has them, but generally only works in major cities, so they're trying to branch out. As is T-Mobile, Verizon is on the lower end of the capital expenditure scale, because they already have such a huge network. And they actually had their own towers for a long time and just sold them off very recently. And so like I said, like the costs are pretty minimal. It's all pretty standard stuff you'd see anywhere. The most important one, like I said, is down there. Adding additional tenants like barely increases your costs. They pay for pretty much everything, like you saw on that slide before. It's pretty minor. It only really does is like you have to make sure like the structure is still structurally sound. It's nothing too crazy. Some of the comparables we have here, like I said, there's only about 3 companies in here, but just some things to point out. Like I said, it is a younger company than these two. Those two also, as you can see from the market cap, are a whole lot bigger. And being so much younger, it's much harder to get up and running in an industry like this because it requires so much debt up front to fund all this. And like I said, that's been hurting them a little bit. And also, like I said, since the towers are so young, they have so much room to grow, you don't see that huge revenue coming from each tower like some of these older guys would who've had the time to put on more and more tenants into each tower. So because of that, the operating margin is understandably a little bit lower than the other ones. And another thing is we also don't, SBA doesn't have a dividend yield yet just because they are such a young company. The other two are also comprised as REITs. So SBA doesn't have any plans to do that in the near future. They haven't indicated any plans, but obviously down the road, once they kind of have everything a little bit more under control and they have some more stable revenues, gotten rid of some of the debt, they can then move into that type of structure. But as you've seen in the valuation, I chose not to do an AFFO simply because they didn't, at the time, have no intent to do that and don't issue a dividend, so I didn't think it was appropriate. So I kind of broke down my investment thesis into like 3 main parts. The first one being domestic in the short term, domestic in the long term, and then international growth, and just like how those 3 growths are going to work together to get there. And so basically, in the domestic short term, there's going to be 2 factors really influence the short-term growth. The first one being data usage, as you all know, you all spend a lot of data, and carrier differentiation. Like I said, there's been a lot of turmoil with the wireless carriers, and they kind of have like 2 methods to gain customers. One is to differentiate themselves from other carriers, and the second is to just have lower prices. Everyone loves lower prices, but if you can say that I have the best coverage in the entire world, then that gets some people over as well. So that kind of battle for first place is going to be a big factor. So just to kind of go on that, you've all seen this Verizon ad, Verizon boasting about how they have the greatest network in the world and how everyone should go to them because you simply can't go without a signal. So like I said, it's going to be everyone competing for that first top spot. And so a little research into so this is like a 4G heat map for Sprint, for example. So this is all their 4G coverage over the US. Apologize for the screenshot, it's a little grainy, but it gets the job done. It's the best way I could represent it without me trying to completely botching it. But so just to show you like that's Sprint, who's probably the least 4G, or it's maybe second least next to T-Mobile. But I'll just go through the 4 of you just to show kind of what the potential is out there. So this is T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon has quite a bit. And then just to put this all in comparison to show you just like how much 4G really has to go and how much potential it has. Like there are towers out there beyond that. This is just the standard cellular towers that are out there in coverage for that. So if we were to go 4G all there, there's quite a bit of potential left and there's quite a bit of room to run really with 4G. Second part of my point was the data usage, and as you can see, and as I'm sure is no surprise to you, data's been skyrocketing recently, and we have just about everything's connected to the internet now, and your phones are almost always downloading stuff from the internet, and so, like I said, not surprisingly, everything's growing up quite a bit. Just to clarify, those numbers are not percentage growth, ones in parentheses. That's like on 2019 what they expect the share of the world's data usage will be. And so more long-term in the US is, I guess, a new technology. And like I said, when cellular came out, we put all cellular on all towers. Then 4G came out, we did the exact same thing, basically doubled the amount of tenants that were on a tower, or spots that were on a tower. Now there's this new technology coming out called AWS-3, which is Advanced Wireless Spectrum. This used to be a government-owned spectrum entirely, and it recently, actually just in early February, went up for auction. The FCC sold off a bunch of licenses, mostly to AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, and various other smaller carriers. Sprint was not a bidder at all because they're still trying to get out their 4G rollout and aren't overwhelming themselves with too many at once. Sorry. And so really what this is showing is that I don't know if you can see here, really, AT&T spent $18 billion on these licenses. And so really what this means is if they're not going to put these on towers, that would just be a huge waste of money. So to capitalize on the $18 billion expenditure, they're going to have to start rolling this out into towers nationwide, really. And I think this is one of their biggest, kind of moves against Verizon to try to compete with them for that coverage. And in reality, this is going to be a pretty big. And what we're seeing is 2016, I think, is the earliest they're going to start seeing them at least get approved to start putting on towers. So I'm sure shortly after that we'll see some uptick in profits there. Then moving on to international growth. This is really put into a pretty similar light as the U.S. It's like we saw earlier, there's pretty much one step behind. We saw initial cellular coverage everywhere, then we rolled out with 4G, and now we're hypothetically going to be doing this AWS spectrum. But with this, again, like the step behind, so they're still working on like the initial cellular rollout, and then once that's complete, then standard of living is a little bit higher. They have the demand for 4G. They'll be able to start rolling that out as well. So again, things are really cheap to build there. It's great. I think it only costs, I want to say, 40% to build there compared to the U.S. And revenues, they can still charge up to 80% of U.S. revenues. So it's again, pretty good business model for that. That's their current 2G coverage, or like basic cellular coverage. You see, it's pretty good, but there's some room to grow. But more importantly is the 4G coverage, which is virtually non-existent. And so you see, definitely room to grow there. So let's take a look at that. Basically, with the valuation, as you saw, I forecasted out pretty far if you saw my model. You see like 10 years, which is pretty unconventional. I thought that was more appropriate considering this is a much more stable company. You're not going to see any crazy cash flows if like all of a sudden Verizon isn't going to pull all their towers off. That wouldn't happen. And so I thought the 10 years would be more representative of where I think this industry is going. Additionally, after that, I think it will go to a much lower perpetual growth rate. As you saw, I forecast a 1% perpetual growth rate. And reason being, once all the towers are up, it's already pretty saturated, the market, so it's pretty hard to keep shoving towers everywhere if you already have the coverage. Granted, if you exceed like the 4 to 5 tenants per tower limit, then you might see some problems. But for the most part, I think it's a much lower growth rate for the extremely long term. Like I said, I arrived at a price of 142 using the free cash from the firm model. And now to go over some risks. First one being huge is their debt. Like they have a ton of debt. Their interest coverage ratio was 1.25. I apologize, I put 0.95 in the first version of the paper. That was a typo. But so they do have enough cash to cover their debts, but it is still, it wouldn't be fiscally responsible. It wouldn't be responsible for me to just get up here and lie about their debts, but they do have quite a bit of debt. But I think it is well managed, and given that there are such long leases and the revenues are so stable, I don't see this as a big problem. There's no giant balloon payment coming up on the debt schedules you can see there. Everything is pretty expected, and I don't see any problems there. And then, oops. Another problem is potentially if carriers were to slow down their CapEx plans. This is a concern considering how much of the price war is going on right now and how much that might hurt their margins. If they get really concerned about having cash, they might start cutting out some of their expansion plans. However, I think this is slightly unlikely to happen only because that would kind of defeat their differentiation. Like if you just give Verizon the lead and say, all right, you're just going to control it all, then it'd be kind of pretty bad call on your part. And frankly, AT&T spending $18 billion on the AWS spectrums, and Verizon also spending $10 billion and Sprint $1.8 billion. It would be foolish to not capitalize on what you've already spent. And another one is M&A risk. If a lot of these carriers start to merge, obviously they will need less spaces on the towers. This is a pretty big issue, especially with all the mergers going on as of late. However, there's kind of two things holding this back. Is first one being, it seems pretty unlikely that would happen, especially since they kind of got broken up a long time ago. It would be interesting to see them go back together and FCC to allow that. Additionally, that would only really have an impact on future growth, since a lot of the wireless carriers already use different bandwidths between them, so it wouldn't be quite as transferable as you would think. So they would have to, however, like I said, on future growth and future tower, they would be able to just use one, be able to provide all their customers. But it wouldn't be as simple as flipping a switch and everyone getting merged into one. And that's about it. So, like I said, I think it's a pretty interesting company. It's a turbulent sector, like I said, and I think this is a very stable company that, while yes, has been levered up to the gills, I think is stable enough to be able to sustain that, and they have a planned ride out of there. And if you have any questions now, I'm happy to take them.